Yeah, so over the last 9 years, we've covered more than 30 country situations in R2P Monitor, and I've also published pieces on roughly 20 other situations via Atrocity Alert. And as a result of this, I've seen a lot of patterns in how atrocity situations evolve, as well as the varieties of responses that have been utilized through the years. If you think about it, 30 country situations in the monitor and 20 others, that's a quarter of the UN membership. So it's a lot of countries, and that includes the range of countries like Syria, where there have been atrocities ongoing the entire length of time that we've been publishing the monitor, as well as countries like this year we did a atrocity alert piece on the United States and risks there, where we're sort of laying out that we don't think atrocities are going to occur tomorrow, but utilizing the framework of analysis, utilizing all that we've learned over the last 10 years, we can see how various risk factors are at play, and countries should be sort of attentive to that from a prevention angle. So I have a lot of lessons learned, but I'll try and pick out kind of the two big ones. And I think that in terms of international response, and this goes a little bit to what Karen was saying about unity of purpose, but builds further from there. I think persistence matters. Persistence, we think a lot in terms of civil society being persistent. It matters for civil society to constantly stay vocal on atrocity situations, like the situation in Myanmar. We'll hear from civil society voices there today. But you need to show that no one can hide because attention has waned. Naming and shaming doesn't always work, but actors know when they're being watched. We've had numerous states through the years defend themselves against the analysis we've presented in the monitor, including the government of Myanmar. They were in a meeting and actually held up a copy of the monitor and said, "This is wrong. We deny everything that's in here." So they know that they're being watched. They know that their actions are facing international scrutiny. But there's also something to be said for persistently prodding governments and others to uphold their responsibility to protect when states are failing. So there's obviously the civil society angle, but the persistence of states and institutions also matter. 10 to 15 years ago when R2P was first adopted and we reflected on the experience of Rwanda, a lot of people always sort of defaulted to thinking about political will. The political will to respond isn't there, and R2P needs to do something to generate that will. And I don't think that's really the heart of the conversation anymore. For so long, I think many people often looked at the Security Council and its failures as a dead end. If the council couldn't pass a resolution, either for lack of agreeing to discuss the situation or the threat of the veto, then that was it. They sort of said, well, there's no will, there's nothing that can be done. But what we've witnessed is that states are trying different avenues. If the UN Security Council doesn't work, okay, what's our next approach? And this relentless pursuit of something to improve the conditions faced by populations has yielded important results. The General Assembly passed a resolution approving investigative mechanisms for Syria. And then states followed up from that with starting universal jurisdiction cases. It's resulted in the authorization of fact-finding missions like the one for Venezuela, which can shine a light on ongoing crimes and compel further international pressure on the government to halt those crimes. So there are lots of little, even micro actions that are taken that all build into kind of a more holistic response to atrocities. But you can't just give up because you've hit one dead end. So that's my big lesson learned on R2P. And I think the more recent lesson that COVID has really brought out is that the need to address risks early before uncontrollable or exogenous variables come into play. A few years ago, the Secretary General's report focused on national resilience to atrocities and building resilient societies. And I think the events of this year with COVID-19 have really clarified my understanding of pressures that can put that resilience to test. We have got many situations that have numerous risk factors, but seem to be just shy of atrocities actually occurring for a long time. And we lack a clear picture on what can serve as a potential trigger. There are many predictable trigger moments like elections or recurring events like anniversaries of past crimes, or even in cases like South Sudan, weather patterns are often associated with sort of the rise of atrocity risks. But there are also often exogenous factors that take countries to the brink. And this year, the factor was the pandemic, which has not only exacerbated a lot of risk factors for atrocities, not least of which being economic inequality, but it's also been utilized as a tool to broaden divisions between people. There are examples in places like Central African Republic this year, where armed groups mobilized hatred against displaced populations and others they considered as outsiders by accusing them of bringing the virus to villages. We've seen similar disparagement of refugees and migrants in Europe even. And to take another more recent example that isn't COVID related, the situation which ignited in Nagorno-Karabakh a couple months ago, there's a history of atrocities there, a history of sporadic violence. And when you combine that with increased hate speech and intergroup tensions and a greater willingness to use heavy weapons, the risk of not just conflict, but conflict where atrocities could be perpetrated goes up significantly. But these tensions were sort of bubbling under the surface for a long time. And while it felt like a question of when rather than if, it was never really clear when or what would trigger that when. And so for me, that the big lesson from both of these is that it's never prudent to ignore warning signs just because there hasn't been recent atrocities or you can't see the spark that's coming. It's really important to double down on improving the societal resilience.